Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.
Reading allows me to escape everyday life.
Hello, welcome to Sundaku. This is the podcast for anyone who just can't walk past a book without picking it up and having a quick read of the back cover. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Sarah Martin. And a new year sees heaps of new books flooding the bookstores.
And we don't even know how many authors or would-be authors are out there still writing.
Maybe the news today about Melbourne writer Jessica Au might keep them at it because it can be worth it.
Certainly can. Jessica's just won Australia's richest literary award, the $100,000 Victorian Prize for Literature, for her short but masterful novel, Cold Enough for Snow. Now, this book's only 98 pages long. It's narrated by a young woman on holiday in Japan with her ageing mother. It's won lots of other impressive awards, including quite a lot of other money, and it's already been translated into 18 languages. Now, we don't do it for the money, but...
Oh, it's always good to get paid. Come on. And especially the amount of time people commit. Now, that's combined with the extra news that the government's released an arts policy that's investing in writing and publishing. So there will be investments in supporting the industry, but there's also looking to be a poet laureate. So keep writing.
And also, don't forget to keep reading. Sarah, you've caught up with Fiona McIntosh.
I have, and I've read 2 of her books in quick succession recently because the lady just knows how to write. She's a very accomplished author and has released The Orphans and Dead Tide, both quite different books. I talked to her more about The Orphans, a little bit about Dead Tide, but you'll hear more about that a little later.
And after that on Sundoku, we'll take a look at the complicated life of a writer of historical fiction. Dominique Wilson is an acclaimed writer of many books set in big historical landscapes, but telling the story of ordinary people caught up in the sweep of history. She's got a very methodical approach to putting her fictional character in a real landscape.
I start an Excel file, and on the horizontal axis I have all my characters' name, and on the vertical axis I start with the year that my story starts, and then just pull down so that I have a year for each row.
Dominique went on to tell me that she checks what was happening in Australia or around the world, and she also looks at things like, when the car appeared on the road and things like that, puts them all into her Excel sheet, and they determine the life of her character.
It gives me the characters' ages, and I can tell whether, they're too young to be enlisting into this war, or this character's been going on for 90-odd years, it's time I killed him off,
Gee, I'm glad she's got a systematic way of working out when someone has to drop off the perch. That's fascinating. I can't wait to hear the whole interview. But first, let's hear from Fiona McIntosh. As I mentioned before, she's a very accomplished author. She's been writing since she was 16 and she's now in her 60s. Originally from the UK, but resides in South Australia. And so what she normally does with her writing is she travels overseas, sets herself in a unique location and finds a story there and sort of sets it through walking through it, through meeting characters. What obviously happened in the last few years is Fiona was stuck here in South Australia. COVID limited her access to the rest of the world. So she's taken the leap and she's brought her stories to us. And she said it's quite a challenge. I first asked her about what it felt like bringing her stories to home turf.
It felt, I have to be honest, absolutely daunting. At the outset for The Orphans, I felt overwhelmed first by the realization that we were all in lockdowns, various types of lockdowns, and that not only could I not get overseas to my usual stomping grounds for my historical story, but I couldn't even get out of my own state. And that was terrifying. And mainly because I've never written an Australian story before, Anyway, I had no choice in it because of the situation with COVID and what was happening around the world. And so I had to just grit my teeth and set to and look into my own backyard of South Australia and think, where is the story going to come from? Because I don't plan stories. When I set out on a big novel, I have little more than a very loose idea for a story. There's usually just a little kernel of an idea. I certainly know who will be my main character and the motivation for that main character. But as to the arc of the story, no real idea. So it was double daunting that, I also had no story yet. So the Orphans, for me, it was like an Everest to climb. And I was very nervous to actually deliver the manuscript to my editor, who just came whizzing back and said, "You are joking. This is the best book you've ever written." And I didn't believe that. I didn't believe it. I thought she's just trying to stabilize me, because I was sort of like, my eyes must have had a crazy look in them when I was actually pressing send. And then I began to get the feedback from the rest of the publishing group, who was saying, "Oh, this is just so brilliant." And then obviously, finally, when it came out and the audience began to embrace it in the way that they have, I'm flabbergasted, and I think in a way I'm grateful that I'm not confident necessarily about my storytelling, that there's still that fear. I think it keeps you sharp. And what I did was all but throw the kitchen sink at the story to make sure that I gave it my absolute best that I could.
It's so apparent through the book that there is a wealth of research. Your eye and your commitment to understanding the history of not just the space, because it's set out around old Adelaide and Port Adelaide in particular.
Yes.
But to understand the disciplines of your characters, a man who's grown up in the shearing sheds out near Farina, and then you've got this young lady who's grown up in the funeral business.
Yeah.
You've done your work.
I have. It was such a strange pairing as well. I put myself in a situation of thinking, how on earth am I to bring a man from the outback, exactly as you've described, grown up around the shearing sheds in the far-flung, beyond the Flinders Ranges, really very much a desert boy. How do you bring that character together with a girl from the city who spent her entire life growing up around the mortuary? I'd put myself in that situation because I'd already committed to Fleur. I knew she was going to be my character. And then Tom erupted in my mind, and I thought, well, how on earth do these two come together? But that's the storyteller's job. And I thought, well, this is now where you pay your dues. It's all very well having these fabulous characters, but they have to work on the page, and they have to feel authentic and credible to your readers, who you really want to topple into the story and not have to ever frown and think, what and why would these two be together? So that was part of the challenge, and it works. That's what's so incredible, I suppose, that by the end of the story, you can't imagine them not being together as they are. And how the story ended up going into a murder and a mystery was beyond me. I mean, as I say, I threw the kitchen sink at it. I really did. And I did do a lot of research to make sure that I understood both of my characters so well that I wouldn't let myself down. And I feel like I've got a monkey off my back. I feel released and free to write more stories in Australia without that fear that I might let people down.
You certainly didn't. Your setting of the scenes were phenomenal. Like even now, and I think I read The Orphans 3 months ago, I can still imagine Fleur's home. The level of detail, not only about them and their lives and their vocations, but also the spaces. I've grown up in South Australia, but having the descriptions of Adelaide in that time, it was quite fascinating to hear about those different sites that maybe get blended in amongst the suburbs now that would have been out at that time.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I was certainly shocked to discover that everything was happening at the port. The port was the most important part of the city, not the city itself. Life and colour and action and jobs were all at the port. The port was our connection to the rest of the world. It wasn't Adelaide. Adelaide was this tiny little thing down the port road where they were even thinking of building a canal so that they could float the goods down to the port, anything coming through the city. So I found all of that endlessly fascinating, because you tend to think that you look at the city we have today, and although it's still a very small city, you just can't imagine it not having all those suburbs, and that there would have been orchards within 5-10 minutes outside of the GPO, or let's say King William Street. And now Adelaide does sprawl, and it's got sprawling suburbs. So I think that was very interesting, and certainly people have enjoyed learning about the port and giving it its due focus, but also learning about the South Australian outback. Because when you think of the outback, you tend to, I don't know why we all think of perhaps Queensland, and maybe we think of the Red Centre, but our own desert is absolutely magnificent, terrifying, but magnificent. And those majestic Flinders, like sentinels on earth looking after us. I mean, it's just brilliant, brilliant. And I was glad to give them their due as well in the story.
In the acknowledgements, you credit your connection to Harrison Funerals and how much time and access they gave you to really understand and learn about their business, that helped you paint a very compassionate picture of what Fleur and her family had done.
Yes, they were pretty amazing. And I think there was an emotional connection because my father passed away in 2019. And one of the things that really kept preying on my mind through my grief, I began to sort of obsess about what did they do to him behind closed doors? You know, what goes on? And I just didn't understand that whole mortuary aspect of undertaking. It's all very well to bury someone or cremate someone and Dad looked beautiful and all of this. But I thought, well, how is that achieved? And it really became an obsession point. And the funeral director was so perceptive, and they were so gentle and kind with us, that he recognized that I was like spinning like a fly around this. And he actually approached me and said, Fiona, when you feel ready, just come back and let me show you what does go on behind closed doors. I'd like you to have that opportunity. And it wasn't an empty offer. And my response, and so it was a year later, without any thought towards storytelling, that I did return to Harrison's Funerals. And they said, come on, we're going to show you everything. And before I knew it, a story was taking shape, because I discovered that mortuary work, in fact, funeral work, was not forbidden, but no women were allowed into that arena. And it really bothered me. And I said, why? And they said, look, funerals down in South Australia certainly were sort of held by the Freemasons. And it was all very much a man's world, and no women were welcome into that world. And yet Adelaide was the first place to, you know, give women the vote in Australia, and to allow women to attend university in Australia and to lecture at university. We were such a forward-thinking state with regard to women. And yet you're saying this. And they said, yes. And I said, right, well, that's that. I'm going to write a story that features a female mortician, and she's going to be the first of her kind in the country. It was then that said, probably the world, Fiona. If you're talking about the 1930s, probably the world. And I said, it's done. She's my character. So now we're talking about a book. And so they said, right. And they rubbed their hands with glee, and they said, let's teach you how to be a mortician. And the same thing happened to me with the wall classing for Tom.
Who did you find for the wall classing?
We were actually, it was all by accident. These things, all these wonderful sort of serendipitous events came together. My husband, we were in lockdown, or certainly trapped in our own state. And he said, oh, look, whilst I was thinking, well, I'm going to work on sourdough and a quilt. He said, well, I'm going to work on finding out more about my family. And the place where all of the first McIntosh came to was Port Adelaide, and then they moved out to the far north of the state. And he said, well, I think I'm going to, try and follow where their footsteps. And he said, will you come with me? And so together we went to this place, we found Farina, and then we went onwards to this sheep station that was immense, just millions and millions of acres. And there was this homestead. And he said, well, it was here. This is where they came. And there was a couple moving around the home. They were volunteers who were something to do with the landscape, making sure that the landscape was being plotted and that all the trees and plants were being plotted and observed and getting the right amount of nutrient, all this amazing stuff going on. And it was him. He's a retired wool classer. And before I knew it, Tom had winked into existence. And he said, yeah, Fiona, I'll teach you. Come on, let's go to the sheds. Let's go to the Witchelina sheds where your husband's forebears would have begun their lives. Come on. And he took me down to these wool sheds and it began. It was just luck, right place, right time, that this bloke was standing there and was happy to help and teach me about the 1930s and shearing in the 1930s, but more so wool classing in the 1930s. I didn't want to play with a shearer. He's too iconic in the Australian mindset, so I steered clear of that drama. And I thought, who else is in the shed that has an interesting role? And the wool classer, I discovered, is far more intriguing than the actual shearers. I mean, their work is brutal and demanding and challenging, but the wool classer is showing a whole sense of, I don't want to say intelligence, but it's more academic what they're doing in the shed. And so that was very interesting to make my character have that quality.
I love that your research for your books is this combination of obvious deep historical research, looking into the detail of the time through, I'm guessing, archive and things like that. But then this following your nose curiosity research where you simply talk with people and ask the question. Do you find more often than not, by just being very open with your curiosity, you do get that invitation to find out more?
Definitely. It's been a trademark of, I've written 40 books now, and I've written 15 of these historicals that require an immense amount of work beforehand. So there's 2 years of research in each of these books. And I would say in every single one, I could cite that absolute moment of luck in meeting the right person, simply because I was on the ground and following my nose. And I roll like that now, Sarah. I don't actually try and organize anything to happen. I just put myself on the ground of wherever my book is set. So that could be Prague, that could be Paris, that could be Farina in the far-flung outback of South Australia. And I know if I mooch around long enough, someone's going to say, and who are you and what are you doing again? And suddenly, things start to happen.
Now the world is opened up again. Are you staying focused in Australia, or is your next historical novel moving back overseas?
Well, the thing is, we've all effectively been in lockdown since the end of 2019. Now, for me, that's 2 historicals in there. So from the end of 2019 to the start of 2023, 2 historical novels needed to have been submitted to my publisher, Penguin. So the next one coming out, which will be at the end of this year, is set in Australia because I had no choice. I was still in lockdown. Yeah, the next one is set in Sydney, and it's set in the Roaring 20s, and it's finished, and we're starting the editing process in the next few days. But the one after that, so for 2024, the book I'm about to start working on, maybe from around March, will be going back to England again. I'll be moving back. So I've already begun the research for that.
I'm astonished at your rate of work, Fiona. Let me just say that you're not only releasing The Orphans, I think, as I say, I got that in October, November 22, but then a couple of months later, I get Dead Tide, a new Jack Hawksworth book, which has also landed in South Australia. I love how you managed to bring him here.
Look, it was a big ask because I was still trapped here, but also the the world of Jack Hawksworth has been optioned by a media company, and they said to me, "Oh, look now, Fiona, it would be great if you could set Jack down under for us." And I said, "Well, why? Why would a Scotland Yard detective be sent out to Australia? You know, it's not only it doesn't make sense to me. To be authentic, it wouldn't be possible. He can't just stomp in and take over from Sapol on a case." So they were like, "Oh, well, work it out, will you?" So I was like, right, okay. So it became my problem. But they also said, "And by the way, we don't want him in Sydney or Melbourne. We want a new landscape, a fresh landscape." And I was like, "Oh, God, how much harder can you make this for me?" And so I had to work it out. And, you know, what do they say? Need is the mother of invention. And so I had to work out, how was I going to get a Scotland Yard detective on the ground into South Australia? Because I decided, well, I might as well keep it on my home turf and make it plausible that he is here and that he's allowed to do what he's doing. So I got the right help with it from the right people. I was speaking to a retired Scotland Yard detective, but also a very senior detective here, who said, "You can make that work." So we were off on this new adventure with Jack, and great fun, really great fun to have him in a more contemporary environment in Adelaide, of all places. You know, sitting down in Rundle Street East and sipping a coffee was just fantastic. And I was sort of pushing my mind back to 2008, 2009 and thinking, what did Adelaide look like, sound like, smell like then? And so it really was fun. And I think certainly anyone who knows Adelaide will get a bit of a kick out of seeing where he goes and what he does. And he ends up on Wallaroo Beach with a lot going on that normally wouldn't happen on Wallaroo Beach. But hey, it's fiction. We can do what we like. So, but really a very interesting story about, you know, black marketing and a real global scam that brings him out, and it's connected with reproductive medicine. So it was all really, what could I say, meaty stuff to get myself involved with.
It was plausible. So your care with that side of things was really great. But it must have felt a bit like showing someone around your city, you know, like in terms
I did.
Yeah.
I was very worried it might turn into a travel log, you know, where, so I was very careful. I had to make it seem sort of natural as opposed to trying to show Jack around Adelaide. I had to keep it like, well, he's here to do something, and he's not here to have a holiday. So I had to make sure that it felt very normal for him to be where he was. That was part of the challenge, but it also made it fun.
It's quite interesting because there's in the news over the last year, there's been questionable materials washing up on shores in the York Peninsula and things like that. And so it was interesting that the potential for the South Australian waters to be a location for something a bit nefarious, you know, it's quite
absolutely possible. It's what set me off, because you know, that's why I thought, well, I think I can pull this off, because we've got a massive coastline, and policing that coastline is pretty hard. And the way that I used that coastline sort of felt very feasible. And then after I'd finished and submitted it, like you say, there was stuff washing up, and I thought, blimey, truth is stranger than fiction. I've already just written this, but here it is sort of happening. I'm now writing the next Jack Hawksworth, and he's back in London. He's back in his stomping ground. But it was great to have him breathing this fresh air in South Australia, you know, and putting to bed another bad guy, so to speak.
Well, it certainly was a lot of fun. Fiona, thank you. This has been lovely to touch on both the Orphans and Dead Tide. Thank you very much.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.
That's Fiona McIntosh. We were speaking there about her two latest books, The Orphans and Dead Tide, and I highly recommend them. They're really quick page turners, but fascinating and quite evocative of our landscape and our space.
Interesting hearing her talk about about writing to a landscape too, because that very much came up in the book that won the big prize that we were talking about earlier, Cold Enough for Snow. The author, Jessica Au, said that she wrote the book in Australia, probably because of COVID reasons. Then she and her mother went to Japan, so she was able to fill in the gaps. She was able to sort of perhaps add colour that she couldn't have found by sitting in her room in Australia writing about another country.
Yes, and I've spoken before with Hannah Kent, who set stories in Ireland and in Iceland and Australia and Germany, and part of her stories are woven from lived experience walking through those spaces, but others are deep in research and watching movies and lots of reading and immersion, and it just shows there are so many different ways to gather your story and find your characters.
And that's very in the present moment way of gathering it, but in the moment we hear from Dominique Wilson, and she gathers the past to create her story. Adelaide author Dominique Wilson was born of French parents in Algiers, and she grew up in a country that was torn by civil war. She and her family fled to Australia. Dominique is a novelist and a short story writer with 3 major historical novels to her credit. The Yellow Papers, set in 19th century China, The Devil's Madness, a Graham Greene-style drama in Algiers, and her most recent book, Orphan Rock. In that, the main character, Bessie, begins life in the 1800s Sydney slums, and her life takes a lot of twists and turns right through to beyond the First World War. Dominique places her fictional characters among real events, and the reader gets an intimate portrait of life for an ordinary person in those turbulent times in history. I talked to her about how she goes about finding that day-to-day detail from the past.
Serendipity. My very first book, The Yellow Papers, I was trying to find how to get one of the main characters an Australian into China during World War II. Couldn't find it anywhere. Australia didn't go into China. Australian military didn't go into China at that time. And I kept searching. And then I saw an obituary. Colonel XYZ, World War II Tulip Force into China. And I thought, hello. Started Googling Tulip Force, and there were maybe half a dozen entries. And the reason why most normal places didn't know about Tulip Force was that it was a secret force put together to teach the Chinese guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. Now, the funny thing is, in those half a dozen things that came up on Google, one was for a book written about Tulip Force from someone. It wasn't a bookshop as such. It was just a person's name who was selling the book. So I rang, and he said to me, "Can I ask what your interest is in Tulip Force?" And I told him. And he said, "That's really interesting because the person who wrote the book was my grandfather." And so we had a lovely long talk. I bought the book, and his grandfather was just a private in Tulip Force, and he wrote it from a private's point of view, which was really helpful. So much history is written by the powerful. This was just an ordinary private who went off and wrote his experiences in it. But what was also very interesting to me was being able to talk to his grandson for ages about, the stories he'd heard from his grandfather. And I put some of those in the Yellow Papers.
It must be so hard pulling it all together at the end, because you go on this incredible journey of discovery. How difficult is it to sit down and then write the story?
I put it together in segments. What I do, which, people tell me, oh, look, there's an easier way of doing it, but it works for me. I start an Excel file, and on the horizontal axis, I have all my characters' name. And on the vertical axis, I start with the year that my story starts, and then just pull down so that I have a year for each, column, each row. And I also have a column, for example, in this book, Sydney history, Australia history, world history, France history. Yeah.
So it's like a visual of what was going on in the world at that time.
Exactly. And extras. And extras are put in things like when fashions suddenly change, or, the car is suddenly it starts appearing on streets and little bits like that. And as I read and as I research, if ever there's anything that I think could be useful, it goes in with the relevant year and the relevant character or the relevant column. And that's really useful also. For example, it gives me the characters' ages, and I can tell whether, they're too young to be enlisting into this war, or this character's been going on for 90 odd years, it's time I killed him off, So yeah, that's how I put it all together.
That's a wonderfully mathematical solution.
It's the only way, because there's so much information, it's the only way I can keep, and if you have a look at my, when I am working on something, I have also tons of separate notes open, each one with more information on what I find on a particular topic.
Now, your own background, you came with your parents from a war-torn background in Algeria. How much has that had to do with you making a life as a writer of historical novels?
Oh.
An awareness of war, I suppose.
I don't know if it was an awareness. I've never been asked that question before. It's a very good question. I think an awareness of differences is more than an awareness of war. More, you said, how much has war informed it earlier. I think it's definitely had some influence. I was born in Algeria. My parents were French living in Algeria. And my book, That Devil's Madness, is based very much on the colonisation and then War of Independence of Algeria. That was a book that had to be written, as far as I'm concerned. But the Algerian War started when I was 2. And we left when I was 10, and it was still going. And during that time, I remember, and it's something that I actually did in my Algerian book, I was friends with a little Arab girl, which I wasn't allowed to be, because, French people did not associate with the Arab population unless they were, coming to clean the house or whatever, or do the laundry. But in school, we were all together. I have school photos where you can tell just by looking, which are the Europeans, well, not all, but some of which are the Europeans and which are, the little Arab kids and so on. And I think we developed what you could almost call the third culture in school. You had your French or Arab culture at home, but then when you came to school, you developed a different culture because you were friends, you were sitting together, sometimes you'd sneak off and wake school together, and, so right from a very early age, I was aware of differences and what was supposed to be considered proper and not proper, except that a lot of what was supposed to be considered proper I didn't think at the time was right anyway. And then, of course, coming to Australia again, I remember in school, my mother used to send us with school lunches of yogurt and things like that, but back then, what's this stuff? So, yeah, I think obviously all this has had...
It gives you an awareness of all the different elements in society, the different people.
And also very much, and even more so currently, I think in our current political climate, how governments will make decisions without really, I don't think, looking at how it affects the ordinary people. The ordinary person in the street, they'll make these decisions to favour businesses, to favour other political parties or whatever. But how often do they say, how is this going to affect the ordinary person? And that's something I like to look at in my in all of my books, how do the big decisions, the big political decisions, affect the ordinary person? Someone without a lot of power, who just has to survive and live through it.
Your books are full of the most intriguing tiny details, like way beyond what you find in libraries, it seems to me. It's almost like what you might find in your great-grandma's bottom drawer, things like that, like recipes and things like that. Give us an example of one of those now. For example, you've got this description of Bessie's wedding, and it's a very detailed description of just what would have actually been served in those days. Can you read that passage out for me?
Sure. They began with a beef consommé, followed by oyster patties, then a salad of tomatoes and celery. A roast suckling pig with apple sauce came next, accompanied by peas, roast potatoes and an onion custard. Then ices and a variety of small dainty cakes.
So you go into an immense amount of detail about those little things. Here's a description of a meal, a kind of slightly special meal, I suppose, given how poor they were, that Bessie whipped up. Can you read that one out?
Sure. While Lottie dealt with the vegetables, Bessie made a pot of tea for Lottie and herself from leaves from that morning's breakfast, then unwrapped the meat and diced a small portion of bacon, keeping the rest for Julian's breakfast the next day. She cut the rabbit into portions and dusted each piece in flour before browning them in a cast-iron pot with the bacon and onions, then added stock, carrots and a small measure of cider. While the rabbit stew simmered, Bessie grated suet she'd rendered previously, mixing it with flour, baking powder, an egg and a little milk. Later that evening she'd mix golden syrup with water, a small knob of butter and the juice of a lemon in a basin, and she'd make dumplings from this dough to place on top for dessert.
So where do you get that detail from?
Cookbooks, old-fashioned cookbooks. Mrs. Beaton's recipe book is very good. I've also got, as you can tell from looking around here, I hoard books.
You have a Sindoko to be very proud of. It looks quite dangerous looking at your wall there of books.
And one of the books I also have where I actually got that recipe from is a copy of a colonial cookbook, an Australian colonial cookbook, which had the recipe and the dumpling with golden syrup. Sometimes
it must be quite hard to find out things that you're fairly sure existed, but you're not completely sure. And you were telling me with the book you're researching at the moment, you were trying to work out whether there was actually a cafeteria at Melbourne University in the 1890s.
That I'm still not sure. I actually contacted Melbourne University. They were helpful, but they didn't really answer my question. So what I'm doing now, I found dozens and dozens of copies of the student journal of that time, the medical school student journal of that time, called The Speculum, typical med student humour. And I'm reading The Speculum, copies and copies and copies of The Speculum, hoping to find somebody mention a cafeteria or tea room or something like that.
So that your character can walk into it.
I mean, it'll only be, one line, and if I can't find it, I'll have a go and sit by the lake that used to exist opposite the medical school and have, eat sandwiches there. But, somebody might say, oh, wow, you're wasting time reading all those speculums, 10 years worth of speculums for, it used to come out 3 or 4 times a year, just to find out whether they had a cafeteria. But it'll only be a line, but while I'm reading that, I'm also finding out so many other bits and pieces, which is, which will go into the book. Like a joke one of the medical students had, he stole, there was a skeleton in one of the room, and he stole the hand of the skeleton. And of course, pretended that it was his own hand, and when he went to meet to this formal thing, and he went to shake hands with this hand made out of bones with this elderly woman, and she nearly fainted, little things like that, which, okay, I may not find out about whether they had a cafeteria, but I'll certainly get a whole lot of little ideas with which to enrich the story.
Just finally, if you could live in any period in history, I mean, as a writer of historical fiction, I imagine you put yourself back there. Which would you choose?
I'd only put myself back there if I could get immunised first against a whole lot of illnesses. I mean, just reading Orphan Rock, they have so many, they had typhoid, they had typhus, they had the Spanish flu, they had so many. I often say when my daughter's here and we're talking about these things, I wish I had a time machine to be able to go back just for a short while, just to find a bit of information I need, and then come back. I don't think I'd want to stay there. But yes, so often, I mean, it would be wonderful to press a button and go into Melbourne Medical School and Melbourne Uni in 1897 and have a quick look around, speak to a couple of students and come back.
Dominique, thanks so much for talking to me today, and all the best with the next book, which you're working busily on here.
Thank you very much, Annie. Thank you.
Historical fiction writer Dominique Wilson. She's author of Orphan Rock, which came out last year, and before that, The Yellow Papers and The Devil's Madness.
This is Sundoku, the podcast for Rusted On readers.
Hi, I'm Joey, I'm 35 and I'm from Adelaide. I always loved stories, and I think my early introduction as we travelled around the world were audio tapes of Narnia and The Hobbit. And that sort of progressed, I guess, into reading, mostly quite old books, but then the teen classics, the Lockie Leonards and all the Choose Your Own Adventures in primary school. And then, I've always read, so kept a strong interest in literature, and now I mainly read non-fiction, but I still sneak a cheeky novel in now and then. When I look back on my favourite books, they're probably ones I picked up whilst, gallivanting around as a late teenager. Things like all the Kurt Vonnegut books, Breakfast of Champions. I remember vividly picking that up in Thailand and devouring it. And then there was a lot of, popular at the time books like Shantaram. Took me 3 months to get through, but that was about how long a ski season was in Canada. So that was a good companion. I think, I look at books really as travel companions at that time of my life. And, good ways to connect with people, because you can give them a book you've just read and they can give you one of theirs. At the moment, I'm retraining, so I've got a lot of technical books to read, and they're luckily quite graphical, but it's all about sort of cities and buildings and things that are very interesting, but a little bit foreign to me, so I'm taking my while to devour them. And that's one of my piles of books by my bed, Sundoku. I guess the other one, I do like to dive back and read really old books when I get a chance. So I'm really keen to read like Dickens and Shakespeare. I love reading like Oscar Wilde playbooks when I pick them up. Like, they're pretty eclectic. I usually just find things and just try to educate myself by going over the classics. I think the physical weight of a book is a very grounding sensation. To have one in your bag that you can pull out whenever you've got a spare minute is a really comforting thing in this fast-paced world.
And we'd love to hear from you if you're keen to share your reading habits and reading past and a glimpse of your Sundoku. Send us a voice memo to sundokukast@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Sarah Martin. Catch you next time. Podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally, Michaela Andreev,
Annie Hastwell,
and me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. TSUNDOKU cast.
Hi, Jeremy Cordeaux in the Court of Public Opinion. I'm just on air here to let you know that we'll be live streaming the Court of Public Opinion every Friday between 9 o'clock and 12 on jeremycordeaux.com. Please join us. We'd love to have you.